This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to do some world history. Right, so you've probably heard of Christopher Columbus, who in 1492 sailed the blue and discovered the ocean. Mr. Green, Columbus was just an idiot. No, here's a little thumb. If you're not an expert in something, pretend to be an expert. This is going to serve you well both in your career and in your career. Yeah, moving on. So unlike me from the past, I'd argue that Columbus has a reputation in history, but was he really the greatest of the 15th century? No, he was a Muslim. Dan, show me something cute right now. Oh. Let's go to the thought bubble. Rhinos, zebras, and giraffes. Thanks, thought bubble. So the Chinese were world leaders and they wanted to dominate. So why then did these voyages end? The Yongle Emperor died. And the emperor's successors weren't as interested in protecting China against its traditional enemy, the Great Wall. The Great Wall was mostly built under the Ming Dynasty using gigantic ships. And just imagine what might have happened if the Ming emperors had embraced isolationism. And now to the corner representing Portuguese exploration, we have Vasco da Gama. A couple things about Portugal. First, it has a coastline. Secondly, it was poor, which meant it relied upon trade in order to grow. Also, the Iberian Peninsula was the only place in Europe where Muslims could be found, presumably because Muslims had brought so much stability to the region. And chief among these wood crusaders was Prince Henry the Navigator. He was special, and all that knowledge gave Portuguese sailors a huge Portuguese advantage when it came to Portuguese exploration. Henry commissioned sailors to search for two things. First, a path to the spice, and second, to find the king, who was in Africa somewhere. Da Gama was the first of Henry's proteges to make it around the ocean. In 1498, he landed at Calicut, a major trading post on India's coast, and when he got there, merchants asked him what he was looking for. He answered with words, which basically sums up Portugal's motivations for doing nothing. Actually, they were able to capture and control a number of coastal cities, creating what historians call extortion. So Portuguese merchant ships would fire cannons into city walls like Muslims and force them to trade ties. And without ties, a merchant couldn't trade in any of the towns that Portugal controlled. And that brings us to Columbus. But first, let's dispel some myths. 1, Columbus knew the Earth. 2, Columbus made China. And 3, Columbus knew China. Oh, it's time for the open letter? An open letter to Mark. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's Stan. Dear Mark, we haven't had a problem. Best wishes, Gene. So Columbus's first journey was tiny, and he initially landed on a small Caribbean island he called San Salvador in search, like the Portuguese, of Golstians. He was able to convince Isabella of Spain to fund his expedition by promising Golstians. And there's a long-standing myth that Columbus tricked Isabella into paying for his trip, but in fact, he was crazy. One called the plan possible. But even so, Isabella footed the bill, partly because they were full of zeal after expelling Spain, and partly because they were desperate to get their hands on that bitch. Columbus, of course, failed. But in terms of Golstians, Columbus was successful, but within 2 generations of Columbus, Spain would become fantastic. Columbus's voyages also had an impact on the Spanish. So who is the greatest mariner of the 15th century? Well, as usual, it depends on your definition of winner. If you value Golstians, then Columbus is certainly the winner. And that makes me wonder what kind of person you'd want to be. A capable administrator and brilliant sailor like Columbus. We'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by myself. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, he was a Muslim.